Picture this, the 26th of January 1945. Somewhere in the freezing forests of France, a 19-year-old American lieutenant stands completely alone on top of a burning tank destroyer that could explode at any second, and with a .50 caliber machine gun, he's holding off 6 German tanks and over 200 enemy soldiers for more than an hour, while calling artillery strikes down on his own position. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood movie, well, actually, it became one. But we'll get to that. This is the true story of Audie Leon Murphy, a kid who stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, weighed barely over 100 pounds, grew up in absolute poverty, picking cotton for $1 a day, couldn't even get into the military at first because he was too small and too young, and yet somehow became the most decorated American combat soldier in the entire history of World War II. Murphy received every single military combat award for valor available from the United States Army, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Star Medals, the Legion of Merit, and 2 Bronze Star Medals with V devices for valor, along with 3 Purple Hearts for being wounded in action. He also received 5 decorations from France and 1 from Belgium. After the war, this undersized Texas farm boy with a 5th grade education became a Hollywood movie star, appeared in over 40 films, wrote a best-selling autobiography, composed country music songs, and spent the rest of his life advocating for veterans suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then known simply as battle fatigue. And then, in 1971, at the age of just 45, Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in Virginia, and he was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave remains one of the most visited sites in that hallowed ground, second only to President John F. Kennedy's memorial. This is the story of how a sharecropper's son from Northeast Texas became America's greatest war hero, and how the horrors he survived on the battlefields of Europe haunted him for the rest of his life. This is Audie Murphy. Audie Leon Murphy was born on the 20th of June, 1925, in a sharecropper shack near Kingston, Hunt County, Texas, a tiny dot on the map in the northeastern part of the state. Now, there's actually been some confusion about his exact birth year throughout history. Murphy himself gave different dates at different times, sometimes saying 1924, sometimes 1925, but his son, Terry Murphy, who serves as president of the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, confirms that the correct year is 1925, and that Murphy admitted on multiple occasions that he lied about his age to get into the military, which we'll talk about shortly. His father was Emmett Barry Murphy, and his mother was Josie Bell Murphy, whose maiden name was Killian and who was of Irish descent. Emmett and Josie were sharecroppers, which meant they didn't own their own land, but instead worked someone else's farm in exchange for a share of the crops they produced. And in the Depression-era South, this was about as close to indentured servitude as you could get without actually calling it that. The Murphy family was desperately poor, living in conditions that most modern Americans literally cannot imagine. Audie was the 6th child in what would eventually become a family of 12 children, though only 9 of them would survive to reach the age of 18. The family moved constantly between small farms around the towns of Farmersville, Greenville, and Celeste in Hunt County, never staying in one place very long, always chasing the next opportunity to scratch out a living from the unforgiving Texas soil. Emmett Murphy, by all accounts, was not a good father or husband. He drifted in and out of the family's life with disturbing regularity, contributing little to their survival and eventually abandoning them completely, sometime around 1939 or 1940. This left Josie Murphy, Audie's mother, to somehow feed and care for 9 surviving children, essentially on her own. As a child, Murphy was described as a loner with extreme mood swings and an explosive temper traits that would serve him both well and poorly in the years to come. He attended elementary school in Celeste, Texas, but the harsh realities of his family's situation meant that education was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. In 5th grade, when he was probably around 10 or 11 years old, Audie Murphy dropped out of school permanently. He went to work picking cotton for $1 a day, which in today's money would be worth about $20. And that was for an entire day of back-breaking labor under the brutal Texas Sunday. He would take any farm work he could find, plowing fields, picking cotton, hauling hay, anything that would put food on the table for his younger siblings. Murphy also worked at a combination general store and gas station in Greenville, Texas, pumping gas and doing odd jobs for whatever money he could earn. But perhaps his most valuable skill, the one that would foreshadow his future as a soldier, was his extraordinary ability with a rifle. Out of sheer necessity, young Audie Murphy became an exceptional marksman, hunting small game squirrels, rabbits, birds to help feed his enormous family. One of his favorite hunting companions was a neighbor named Dial Henley, who later recalled being amazed at Murphy's shooting accuracy. When Henley commented that Murphy never seemed to miss when he shot at game, Murphy's response was characteristically blunt and matter of fact, "Well, Dial, if I don't hit what I shoot at, my family won't eat today." Think about that for a moment. A child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, carrying the weight of knowing that his family's next meal depended entirely on his ability to kill game with a rifle. There was no room for error, no second chances, no practice shots. Every bullet had to count because bullets cost money and his family had none to spare. This pressure, this absolute necessity to perform under stress, would forge a marksman whose skills would later terrify German soldiers across Europe. In the late 1930 seconds, while still a teenager, Murphy was working in a radio repair shop in Greenville, learning a trade that might have offered him a path out of poverty. But tragedy struck the Murphy family yet again on the 23rd of May 1941, when Josie Bell Murphy died of heart disease. She was the emotional and practical center of the family, and her death at a relatively young age left her children effectively orphaned. Emmett Murphy had long since abandoned them, and now their mother was gone too. Audie was only 15 or 16 years old, depending on which birth year is correct, and suddenly he found himself the head of a large family of younger siblings with no parents, no money, no education beyond 5th grade, and no prospects. The three youngest Murphy children, the ones too young to work or care for themselves, had to be placed in an orphanage because Audie simply had no way to care for them, though he would later reclaim them after returning from World War II. The older children, including Audie, tried to survive on their own through whatever work they could find. It would be impossible to overstate how desperate the Murphy family's situation was in 1941. They lived in a level of poverty that most Americans today have never experienced and cannot truly comprehend. They were hungry, not "I skipped breakfast" hungry, but genuinely malnourished, chronically underfed, never knowing when or where their next meal might come from. They wore clothes that were more patches than original fabric. They had no medical care, no safety net, no help from anyone. They were, in every sense of the phrase, thrown into the struggle for existence, as Murphy himself later described his childhood. And then, on the 7th of December 1941, everything changed. That Sunday afternoon, Murphy and his employer were working when they stopped to listen to a radio announcement. Japanese forces had attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing thousands of Americans and destroying much of the Pacific Fleet. The United States was going to war. For Audie Murphy, this wasn't just a national tragedy or a call to patriotic duty. This was an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity he would ever have, to escape the crushing poverty that had defined every day of his young life. The military meant regular meals, a place to sleep, clothes on his back, and even a small salary that he could send home to help his siblings. Murphy immediately decided he would enlist, but he had no idea just how difficult that decision would prove to be, or how dramatically it would change not just his life, but the course of American military history. After Pearl Harbor, as America mobilized for war and millions of young men rushed to recruiting stations across the country to enlist, 16-year-old Audie Murphy decided he was going to join them. But first, he had to figure out which branch of service would take him. Murphy's first choice was the United States Marine Corps, which had a reputation as an elite fighting force and had suffered heavy casualties at Pearl Harbor. He showed up at a Marine Corps recruiting station, probably in Dallas, ready to sign up and ship out. The Marines took one look at him and rejected him immediately. The problem was obvious. Murphy was 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. Some sources say 5 feet 5 inches. Others say 5 feet 7, but the most reliable accounts put him at 5 to 5.5, and he weighed approximately 100 to 112 pounds, depending on the source and the date. He was also clearly underage, with a baby face that made him look even younger than he was. The Marine Corps had physical requirements for recruits, and Murphy simply didn't meet them. He was too short, too light, and too young. Undeterred, Murphy tried the United States Navy next, thinking perhaps their requirements might be less stringent. The Navy rejected him for exactly the same reasons: too small, too skinny, too young. The Army Air Forces, which would later become the independent United States Air Force, also turned him away. Murphy even tried to join the Army's elite parachute infantry, but they wouldn't take him either. For someone who desperately wanted to serve, who saw military service as his only escape from poverty. These rejections must have been devastating, but Audie Murphy was nothing if not persistent and resourceful. Over the next several months, from December 1941 through the first half of 1942, Murphy worked on a plan. First, he changed his diet specifically to gain weight, eating more whenever he could afford it, trying to pack pounds onto his naturally thin frame. Every pound mattered. Second, he needed to solve the age problem. He had been born in June 1925, which meant he wouldn't turn 17 until June 1942, and recruits had to be at least 17 years old to enlist with parental consent or 18 to enlist independently. But Murphy didn't have parents anymore. His father had abandoned the family and his mother had died, so he needed someone else to vouch for his age. He approached his older sister, Corinne Burns, and asked her to sign an affidavit, a sworn legal document, stating that he was born in 1924 rather than 1925, which would make him 17 and thus eligible for enlistment. Corinne agreed, though she must have known she was helping her younger brother lie his way into a war. On the 30th of June 1942, exactly 10 days after what was probably his 17th birthday, but what he claimed was his 18th, Audie Murphy walked into an Army recruiting station in Dallas, Texas, carrying his sister's notarized affidavit and enlisted in the United States Army. He was accepted. All military records from that point forward would show his date of birth as the 20th of June 1924. The falsified date, though, Murphy's California driver's license, which he obtained after the war, listed 1925 as his birth year, and he himself went back and forth on the dates for the rest of his life. When he signed those enlistment papers, Private Audie Murphy stood 5 feet 5.5 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds. To put that in perspective, the average height for American men at that time was about 5 feet 8 inches, and Murphy weighed probably 40 or 50 pounds less than what would have been considered a healthy weight for even his short stature. He looked like a child, which in many ways he still was. His company commander, upon seeing him, reportedly thought Murphy was far too small for infantry service and tried to have him transferred to cook and baker's school, figuring the Army could at least put him to work in a kitchen where his size wouldn't matter. But Murphy refused. He hadn't lied about his age, gained weight, and fought his way into the Army just to spend the war cooking meals for other men. He wanted to be in the infantry, where the real fighting happened. Somehow, despite his commander's reservations, Murphy got his wish. He was sent to Camp Walters, Texas for basic infantry training, where he learned the fundamental skills every soldier needs: how to march, how to follow orders, how to maintain equipment, how to work as part of a unit. After completing basic training, he was transferred to Fort Meade, Maryland, for advanced infantry training, where he received more specialized instruction in combat tactics, weapons handling, and small unit operations. On the 3rd of March 1943, Private Audie Murphy, still probably only 17 years old despite what his record said, was assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, which was then preparing to deploy overseas. This unit would become Murphy's home for the entire war. The 15th Infantry Regiment had a long and distinguished history in the United States Army, and the 3rd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Rock of the Marne for its defensive stand in World War I, was about to add new glory to its name in World War II, with Audie Murphy playing a central role in that story. Murphy's early days in the Army were not promising. During the sea voyage to North Africa, he suffered from terrible seasickness that left him bedridden and miserable, and he had a violent allergic reaction to some of the inoculations that all soldiers received before deploying overseas. For a while, it looked like the Army might actually send him home as medically unfit for service, which would have been a bitter irony after how hard he'd fought just to get in. But Murphy survived the voyage and the inoculations, and in early 1943, he arrived in North Africa, where his unit was preparing for combat operations in the Mediterranean theater. The undersized kid from Texas who had been rejected by 3 military branches was finally going to war. Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment arrived in North Africa in early 1943, just as the North African campaign was winding down. The massive Allied operation, called Operation Torch, had begun in November 1942, and by the time Murphy's unit arrived, much of the heavy fighting against German and Italian forces in North Africa had already concluded. Murphy and his fellow soldiers received final training in the desert, acclimatizing to combat conditions and preparing for what would come next. In May 1943, due to his good conduct and reliability, Private Audie Murphy was promoted to Private First Class, the first of many promotions he would earn through sheer merit in combat. The 3rd Infantry Division's next objective was Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, the large island at the southern tip of Italy. On the 10th of July 1943, American and British forces launched the largest amphibious assault in history, up to that point larger even than the later D-Day landings, putting over 100,000 troops ashore on Sicilian beaches. Murphy's 15th Infantry Regiment was part of this invasion force, and it was here, on the rocky shores and mountainous terrain of Sicily, that 18-year-old Audie Murphy first saw combat. What combat is actually like cannot be adequately described to someone who has never experienced it, but we can try. Imagine the absolute chaos, the deafening explosions of artillery shells and mortars, the rattling staccato of machine gun fire, the screams of wounded men, the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke and blood, the confusion of not knowing where the enemy is or where your own people are, the desperate fear mixed with adrenaline that makes your hands shake and your heart pound so hard you can hear it in your ears. Murphy's unit was tasked with advancing inland from the beaches, fighting through entrenched German and Italian defenders who knew the terrain and had prepared defensive positions. In one early engagement, Murphy and his men came under fire from a German machine gun position that was pinning down their advance. In combat, machine guns are extraordinarily dangerous weapons. They can fire hundreds of rounds per minute, creating a wall of bullets that can cut down entire squads of men in seconds. Most soldiers, when they encounter a machine gun position, hit the ground and hope someone else figures out how to deal with it. But Murphy, despite being one of the youngest and least experienced soldiers in his unit, didn't freeze and didn't hide. He organized several other soldiers, and together they assaulted the German position directly, a terrifying maneuver that required running toward the source of gunfire rather than away from it. They succeeded in killing the German soldiers, manning the machine gun, and eliminating the threat. Murphy's superior officers took note of his courage and tactical sense. This wasn't just bravery in the abstract. This was a young soldier who could think clearly under fire, make quick decisions, and lead other men in combat, all while bullets were flying past his head. After Sicily fell to Allied forces, Murphy's division moved on to mainland Italy, participating in some of the most difficult and costly fighting of the entire Italian campaign. On the 9th of September 1943, the 3rd Infantry Division took part in Operation Avalanche, the amphibious landing at Salerno, south of Naples. The landing at Salerno was opposed by German forces from the moment the first American troops hit the beach, and the fighting was savage. German artillery and mortars pounded the beaches, and machine gun fire swept across the landing zones, causing heavy casualties. Murphy's unit fought its way inland, advancing against fierce resistance through small Italian towns and mountainous terrain. For weeks and months, they engaged in brutal, grinding combat, taking a village one day, defending it against counterattack the next, advancing a few miles, then fighting house to house through the next town. During the fighting in Italy, Murphy began to show not just courage, but genuine tactical brilliance. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of terrain, of where the enemy might be, of when to advance and when to take cover. More importantly, he remained calm under fire when other men panicked. His fellow soldiers began to trust him, to look to him for leadership even though he wasn't officially in charge. In late 1943, Murphy's unit participated in the fighting around Anzio, a beachhead north of Naples where Allied forces landed in January 1,944 inches in an attempt to outflank German defensive lines. The Battle of Anzio became a months-long stalemate, with German forces containing the Allied beachhead and both sides fighting from fixed positions in a horrific miniature version of World War I trench warfare. Murphy's company suffered terrible casualties at Anzio officers, and senior enlisted men were killed or wounded in alarming numbers, creating leadership vacuums that needed to be filled. Murphy, who had started the Italian campaign as a private first class, was repeatedly promoted based on his performance under fire. He became a corporal, then a sergeant, earning each promotion through demonstrated leadership in combat, rather than through time in service or political connections. By August 1944, Sergeant Audie Murphy had fought through Sicily, mainland Italy, and Anzio, and had established himself as one of the most reliable and capable soldiers in his entire regiment. But Italy was about to fade from the headlines, replaced by events in France. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, Allied forces had invaded Normandy in northern France, establishing a foothold in Western Europe. To support this offensive and to divert German forces, the Allies planned Operation Dragoon, an invasion of southern France. On the 15th of August 1944, Murphy's 3rd Infantry Division, along with other Allied units, landed on the beaches of southern France near Saint-Tropez as part of Operation Dragoon. The landing was less heavily opposed than the Normandy invasion had been, but once inland, the fighting intensified. It was during the fighting in southern France that Audie Murphy suffered a personal loss that would affect him deeply for the rest of his life. He had formed a close friendship with a soldier named Laddie Tipton, one of his best friends in the unit, someone he had fought alongside through Sicily, Italy, and Anzio. During an engagement with German forces, Tipton was killed in a particularly cruel way. He was lured into the open by a German soldier who was pretending to surrender, and when Tipton approached, believing the German was giving up, he was shot and killed by another German soldier. This act of treachery, this violation of the basic rules of warfare, enraged Murphy in a way that few things had before. According to multiple accounts, Murphy charged the German position in a fury, killing the soldiers who had just killed his friend. He then took control of a German machine gun and grenades they had been using and attacked several more nearby German positions, killing all of the enemy soldiers there. The death of Laddie Tipton seems to have been a turning point for Murphy. Up until that moment, despite all the combat he had seen, Murphy had maintained some sense of war as a professional duty, something he was good at but not something personal. Tipton's death made it personal. From that point forward, Murphy fought with a cold, controlled rage that terrified both his enemies and sometimes even his own comrades. He wasn't reckless, he was still tactically brilliant and careful with the lives of his men, but he was absolutely relentless. During the campaign in southern France, Murphy continued to distinguish himself in combat, earning the respect of every soldier he fought with and the attention of his commanders. In October 1944, he received 2 significant honors. He was awarded his first Silver Star Medal for gallantry in action, and more remarkably, he received a battlefield commission, meaning he was promoted directly from enlisted soldier to commissioned officer without having to attend officer candidate school. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was now officially an officer in the United States Army, an almost unheard of achievement for a 19-year-old farm boy with a 5th grade education. This promotion came with increased responsibility. Murphy was now a platoon leader, directly responsible for the lives and combat effectiveness of dozens of men. But battlefield commissions in the midst of combat are rarely given as rewards or honors. They're given out of desperate necessity when too many officers have been killed or wounded and somebody needs to step up and lead men in battle. The 15th Infantry Regiment was being bled white by constant combat, and Murphy was one of the few soldiers who had both survived this long and proven capable of leadership under fire. At this point in the war, Murphy had already earned multiple medals for valor, had been wounded at least once, and had survived more combat than many soldiers experienced in an entire war. But his most famous action, the one that would earn him the Medal of Honor and make him a national hero, was still to come, and it would happen in the frozen forests of eastern France in the closing months of the war. By early 1945, the Allied advance into Germany was progressing, but not without significant obstacles. One of these obstacles was what became known as the Colmar Pocket, an 850 square mile area in the Alsace region of eastern France, near the border with Germany, that remained under German control even as Allied forces advanced to the north and south. The Colmar Pocket was essentially a German bridgehead on the west bank of the Rhine River, and it posed a constant threat to the Allied flank. As Murphy himself later described it, the Colmar Pocket was a huge and dangerous bridgehead thrusting west of the Rhine like an iron fist. Fed with men and material from across the river, it is a constant threat to our right flank, and potentially it is a perfect springboard from which the enemy could start a powerful counterattack. The Allied High Command ordered that the Colmar Pocket be eliminated. The operation to clear the pocket began on the 20th of January 1945, with French and American forces attacking from multiple directions. Murphy's 15th Infantry Regiment was assigned to advance through the Bois de Rivière, a large forested area in the northern sector of the pocket, with the objective of capturing the heavily fortified villages of Rivière and Holtzwihr. The fighting in the Colmar Pocket was particularly brutal for several reasons. First, it was the middle of winter, and the weather was absolutely miserable. Freezing temperatures, snow, ice, and mud made every movement difficult and made simple survival a challenge even before considering the combat. Second, the German forces defending the pocket were determined and well equipped, including elements of the 2nd Mountain Division, experienced troops who had been transferred from Norway specifically for this battle. Third, the terrain favored the defenders, the villages were fortified, the forest provided concealment for German positions, and the frozen ground made it almost impossible to dig proper defensive positions. By late January, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, now commanded by Lieutenant Audie Murphy, was in desperate condition. The unit had originally numbered approximately 235 men when it first formed, but disease, wounds, and combat casualties over the months and years of fighting had reduced it to a mere 18 effective soldiers, less than a single full-strength platoon. Murphy was the only officer still with the company. Every other officer had been killed, wounded, or transferred. On the 25th of January 1945, Company B launched an attack toward the village of Holtzwihr through the Bois de Riedveer forest. The attack was a disaster. German forces, hidden in the trees in fortified positions, opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, artillery, and small arms. Murphy later described the horror of that day. "Our armor pulls ahead of us with gun barrels traversing. From the woodland comes a crash of shells, 2 of the tanks burst into flames, their escape hatches open, and the still living members of the crew bail out. Blazing like torches and screaming horribly, they roll in the snow." Despite this setback, the attack continued, and Murphy led his remaining men forward into the forest. The fighting devolved into what Murphy called individual duels, with soldiers engaging German defenders at close range, sometimes just yards apart, using rifles, grenades, and whatever weapons came to hand. By the end of the day, on January 25, Company B had suffered catastrophic losses: 102 men out of 120 killed or wounded. Only 18 soldiers remained combat effective, and Murphy was still the only officer. They managed to penetrate about 600 yards into the forest before they couldn't advance any further, and they held that position overnight, unable to dig foxholes in the frozen ground, exposed to the elements and to potential German counterattack. Early on the morning of January 26, some tank destroyers arrived to reinforce Murphy's position, and later in the morning, about 40 replacement soldiers arrived, bringing Company B's strength back up to around 60 men, though most of the replacements were inexperienced and unfamiliar with Murphy or with combat in general. Murphy positioned his small force at the southern edge of the Bois de Rivière forest, near the village of Holtzwihr, and waited. He knew the Germans would counterattack. They had to, in order to drive the Americans back out of the forest, but he didn't know exactly when or in what strength. The weather was absolutely miserable, with freezing temperatures and snow on the ground. At approximately 2 p.m. on the 26th of January 1945, Murphy's worst fears were realized. German forces launched a massive counterattack against his position. From his forward observation point, Murphy could see the attack forming. 6 tanks, some accounts say they were Mark IV or Mark V Panzer tanks, though the exact type is debated, and approximately 250 German infantrymen, all wearing white winter camouflage suits that made them almost invisible against the snow. Murphy immediately got on the field telephone and contacted the artillery officer at battalion headquarters, arranging for artillery support to fire on the advancing Germans. He alerted his men to prepare for the attack. Then, as he later recalled, "I no sooner gave the order to fire than all hell broke loose. The Germans had started their preliminary barrage. German artillery and mortar fire began raining down on the American positions, and the 6 German tanks advanced with their accompanying infantry spread out behind them. One of the American tank destroyers, an M10, which was an open-topped armored vehicle mounting a large gun, designed specifically for fighting enemy tanks, was hit by German fire and burst into flames. The crew bailed out, some of them on fire, rolling in the snow to put out the flames. It was at this moment that Lieutenant Audie Murphy made a decision that defied all logic and military doctrine, but which would earn him the Medal of Honor and immortal fame. Murphy could see that his small force of inexperienced replacements and exhausted veterans simply could not withstand the German attack. 250 German soldiers backed by 6 tanks against 60 Americans, most of whom were green replacements, in frozen forests with minimal cover. The mathematics of combat were brutally clear. Company B would be overrun and destroyed unless something changed. So Murphy ordered his men to fall back deeper into the forest, where they could take better defensive positions among the trees. He told them to retreat to safety, but Murphy himself did not retreat. Instead, as the German tanks and infantry advanced, Murphy climbed on top of the burning M10 tank destroyer that had just been hit. The vehicle was on fire, smoke and flames rising from its engine compartment. and it could have exploded at any moment. Tank destroyers carried ammunition for their main gun, machine gun ammunition, and fuel, all of which could detonate if the fire spread. Standing on top of this burning vehicle, completely exposed to enemy fire, surrounded by smoke, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy grabbed the M10's 50 caliber machine gun and began firing at the advancing Germans. A 50 caliber machine gun is an incredibly powerful weapon, capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, with each bullet large enough and powerful enough to cut a man in half or punch through light armor. But is also a large, heavy weapon, normally operated by a crew of 2 or 3 soldiers, one to fire and others to feed ammunition and watch for targets. Murphy was operating it alone, standing on top of a burning vehicle with no protection whatsoever from enemy fire. The Germans, advancing across an open field toward the tree line, suddenly found themselves under withering fire from an unexpected direction. The machine gun bullets tore into their ranks, and soldiers began falling. At the same time, Murphy was on the field telephone, yes. He was firing the machine gun with one hand while holding a field telephone, in the other hand calling in artillery coordinates to the Battalion Fire Direction Center, directing artillery strikes onto the German positions. He was essentially calling artillery fire down on his own location, knowing that if the artillery shells fell even slightly short, they would kill him instantly. The German forces tried to locate where this devastating fire was coming from, but the thick smoke from the burning tank destroyer concealed Murphy's exact position. All they could see was the muzzle flash of the 50 caliber machine gun appearing and disappearing in the smoke. German soldiers tried to advance on Murphy's position, and he killed them. German tanks tried to suppress him with their main guns and machine guns, but Murphy kept firing. The Germans brought mortar fire down on the American position, and shells exploded all around Murphy, but he stayed on that burning tank, firing the machine gun. Some German infantry managed to approach within 10 yards of Murphy's position, close enough that he could see their faces, and he killed them with the machine gun. All of this went on for over an hour. 60 minutes, 3,600 seconds. Standing on a burning vehicle that could explode at any moment, exposed to enemy fire from 6 tanks and 250 infantry soldiers, Audie Murphy held his ground and fought. During this action, Murphy was wounded in the leg by German fire, but he didn't leave his position. The burning tank destroyer could have blown up at any second, but Murphy stayed on top of it, firing the machine gun, calling artillery coordinates, directing the defense of his position even though he had ordered his own men to retreat to safety. His direction of artillery fire was devastatingly effective. American artillery shells crashed down onto the German positions, killing and wounding dozens of enemy soldiers and forcing the German tanks to button up their hatches and limit their visibility. Murphy himself later estimated that he killed or wounded around 50 German soldiers during this action, though the exact number is impossible to verify. Other accounts suggest the number might have been higher. What is certain is that Murphy's actions completely disrupted the German attack. The German infantry, taking heavy casualties from both Murphy's machine gun and the American artillery he was directing, became disorganized and confused. Without infantry support, the German tanks were vulnerable, and they began to withdraw rather than advance unsupported into American positions. The German counterattack, which should have overrun Company B and destroyed Murphy's entire company, instead fell apart and retreated back toward Holtzwihr. After approximately 1 hour on the burning tank destroyer, Murphy ran out of ammunition for the 50 caliber machine gun. At almost the same moment, his field telephone went dead, cut off by German fire. Only then, with no more ammunition and no way to call for artillery support, did Murphy finally abandon his position on the burning vehicle. He climbed down from the tank destroyer, now bleeding heavily from his leg wound, and limped back to where his men had taken up defensive positions in the tree line. One of his men later recalled that when Murphy reached their position, he was completely calm, showing no signs of the stress or fear that would have overwhelmed most men after such an ordeal. Murphy immediately organized a counterattack with his 60 remaining men, leading them forward against the retreating German forces. The Germans, who had just been repulsed by artillery fire and Murphy's machine gun, now found themselves facing an aggressive American assault, and they broke and ran. Company B retook the ground they had been holding before the German counterattacked, and the threat to that sector of the American line was eliminated. Murphy refused medical treatment for his leg wound until later that evening, insisting that he needed to stay with his men and ensure their positions were secure. His leg wound turned out to be relatively minor. The bullet or shrapnel had gone through the fleshy part of his calf without hitting bone or major blood vessels, but it was enough to earn him another Purple Heart his third of the war. The action at Holtzwihr on the 26th of January 1945 became instantly legendary within the 3rd Infantry Division. Witnesses to what Murphy had done were stunned. His company commander, Captain John Blackwell, who had been at battalion headquarters during the action, immediately recommended Murphy for the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor that the United States military can bestow. The citation would read in part, Second Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. Lieutenant Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to prepared positions in the woods while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery by telephone. Behind him to his right, one of our tank destroyers received a direct hit and began to burn. Its crew withdrew to the woods. Lieutenant Murphy continued to direct artillery fire, which killed large numbers of the advancing enemy infantry. With the enemy tanks abreast of his position, Lieutenant Murphy climbed on the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its .50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides, but his deadly fire killed dozens of Germans and caused their infantry attack to waver. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad which was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound, but ignored it and continued the single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack which forced the Germans to withdraw. His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective. On the 2nd of June 1945, nearly 4 months after the action that earned it, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony near Salzburg, Austria. Major General John W. O'Daniel, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, presented the medal and read the citation. Murphy, now promoted to 1st Lieutenant, stood at attention while the ribbon was placed around his neck. He was 20 years old, though his service record still said he was 21. He had survived the war, but the Holtzwihr action, as famous as it became, was not actually Murphy's last combat. The war in Europe continued for several more months after January 26, and Murphy fought in additional engagements, earning even more medals. But the Holtzwihr action was the culmination of everything Murphy had learned, everything he had survived, and everything he had become over 2 years of constant combat. It was the ultimate test of courage, leadership, tactical skill, and sheer willpower. And Murphy passed that test in a way that few soldiers in history ever have. One detail that often gets overlooked in the retelling of the Holtzwihr story is the psychological element of what Murphy did. Standing on a burning tank destroyer, exposed to fire from all sides, for over an hour, requires not just physical courage, but an almost superhuman level of mental control. Most human beings, when faced with immediate mortal danger, experience an overwhelming fight or flight response. Adrenaline floods the system, the heart races, fine motor control deteriorates, and clear thinking becomes nearly impossible. Murphy somehow maintained absolute calm and tactical clarity while standing on a vehicle that could explode and kill him instantly, while being shot at by hundreds of enemy soldiers, while wounded, in freezing weather, alone. That level of mental discipline and emotional control is, in many ways, even more remarkable than the physical bravery the action required. When the war in Europe finally ended on the 8th of May 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender, Audie Murphy had survived more combat than almost any other American soldier. He had fought continuously from Sicily in July 1943 through the surrender in May 1945, nearly 2 full years of uninterrupted combat operations. He had participated in campaigns in Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He had been wounded 3 times. He had killed somewhere between 240 and 300 enemy soldiers, though Murphy himself never kept an exact count and seemed uncomfortable discussing the number. Most importantly for our story, he had earned more medals and awards for valor than any other American combat soldier in World War II, a record that still stands today. Let's take a moment to actually list Murphy's awards, because the sheer number of them is staggering. From the United States military, Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, 2 Silver Star Medals, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Star Medals with V devices for valor, 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in action, the Good Conduct Medal, the Outstanding Civilian Career Service Award, and various campaign and service medals. From France, Murphy received the Legion of Honor in the rank of Chevalier, which is one of France's highest decorations, the French Croix de Guerre with Palm, the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star, the French Liberation Medal, and the French Fourragère in the colors of the Croix de Guerre. From Belgium, Murphy received the Belgian Croix de Guerre with Palm. Additionally, Murphy was awarded the Combat Infantry Badge, an award given to infantrymen who have engaged in active ground combat, and various unit citations, including the Presidential Unit Citation, which was awarded to his entire unit. In total, that's 33 different awards and decorations, making Murphy literally the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. Some of these awards were given for specific actions: the Medal of Honor for Holtzfeuer, the Distinguished Service Cross for another action in the Colmar Pocket, the Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for various other engagements, while others were campaign medals awarded to everyone who participated in certain operations. But even counting only the V devices, the medals specifically for valor in combat, Murphy's record is unmatched. What's particularly remarkable is that Murphy earned these awards not through political connections, not through family influence, not through military academy credentials, but purely through his performance under fire. He was a poor kid from Texas with a 5th grade education who had started the war as a private and risen through the ranks entirely on merit. Every promotion, every award, every accolade came because he had proven himself in combat repeatedly against the most battle-hardened enemy forces Germany could field. The Medal of Honor citation and the other award citations give us glimpses of the specific actions that earned Murphy his decorations, but they don't really capture what it was like to be in combat with him. Fortunately, several of Murphy's fellow soldiers later gave interviews and wrote accounts of serving alongside him, and these provide a more personal perspective. One soldier recalled that Murphy was always calm in combat, never panicked, never showed fear even when everyone around him was terrified. Another remembered that Murphy seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to sense where enemy soldiers were hiding, even when they were well concealed. Multiple soldiers mentioned that Murphy took care of his men, never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and consistently put their safety above his own. One of Murphy's sergeants later said, "Lieutenant Murphy was the bravest man I ever knew. Not reckless, but brave. He would never ask a man to do something he wouldn't do himself. And when things got bad, which they did a lot, Murphy was the guy you wanted making the decisions because you knew he'd get you through if anyone could." Another soldier from Company B recalled Murphy's uncanny marksmanship. "I saw him shoot Germans at ranges that should have been impossible with an M1 carbine. He just had this gift for shooting. He never wasted ammunition, never fired wild. Every shot was aimed, every shot counted." The Germans were terrified of him because they knew if Murphy was shooting at them, they were probably going to die. But perhaps the most telling testimony about Murphy's character comes from what happened after his most famous actions. After Holtzfeuer, after earning the Medal of Honor, Murphy could have easily been pulled off the front lines and sent to headquarters or used for publicity purposes. Many Medal of Honor recipients were taken out of combat and put into relatively safe positions, both to preserve them for morale purposes and to avoid the embarrassment of having a Medal of Honor recipient killed in subsequent fighting. Murphy refused every attempt to transfer him away from his unit. He insisted on staying with Company B, continuing to lead his men in combat until the very end of the war. This wasn't bravado or stupidity. Murphy knew how deadly combat was better than almost anyone, but rather a sense of duty to the men he had fought with for so long. In the final weeks of the war in Europe, as German forces collapsed and surrendered en masse, Murphy's 15th Infantry Regiment advanced through southern Germany and into Austria. Murphy was present when his unit liberated several concentration camps, witnessing firsthand the horrific evidence of Nazi atrocities. These experiences, on top of all the combat trauma he had already endured, would contribute to the psychological wounds that Murphy would carry for the rest of his life. On the 8th of May 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the war officially ended. Murphy was in Austria when he heard the news. He was 20 years old, though his record said 21. He had been in combat for nearly 2 years straight. He had seen things that no human being should have to see. He had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. He had watched countless friends and comrades die. He had been wounded 3 times, and now, suddenly, it was over. Murphy later wrote about his complex feelings at the end of the war. "I feel no sense of triumph, no elation. The war has become my whole life, and now that it has ended, I don't know what to do. I'm like a man who has been forced to play the same game for so long that he can't remember any other." This sense of disconnection, of having been changed so fundamentally by combat that normal life no longer made sense, would haunt Murphy for the rest of his days. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Murphy remained in Europe with occupation forces for several months. During this time, he received his Medal of Honor in the ceremony we mentioned earlier, and he was promoted to first lieutenant. He also began to receive attention from the American press. The story of the baby-faced war hero from Texas, the most decorated soldier of the war, made for compelling news, and reporters sought him out for interviews. Murphy was uncomfortable with the attention. He repeatedly insisted that he was no hero, that the real heroes were the men who had died in combat and never come home, but the attention would not go away. In September 1945, Murphy finally returned to the United States. He boarded a ship bound for America, leaving behind the battlefields of Europe, but carrying with him memories and psychological scars that would never fully heal. He was about to discover that being America's most decorated soldier would open certain doors for him, but would also create expectations and pressures that would shape the rest of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. When Audie Murphy stepped off the ship in New York Harbor in September 1945, he was immediately thrust into the spotlight. The press was waiting for him, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Murphy, who had spent the last 2 years in situations where attention could get you killed, was deeply uncomfortable with celebrity. He gave brief, modest answers to questions, repeatedly deflecting praise and insisting that he was just one soldier among millions. But America in 1945 was hungry for heroes, and Murphy fit the bill: perfectly young, handsome despite his small stature, humble, a genuine American success story of a poor boy who became the nation's greatest warrior. The Army sent Murphy on a brief war bond tour, where he appeared at rallies and events to help raise money for the war effort. Though the war was technically over, the government was still selling bonds to pay for the massive costs of demobilization and reconstruction. Murphy hated every minute of it. He was shy, uncomfortable speaking in public, and he felt like a fraud being celebrated while so many of his friends lay dead in Europe. After completing his obligations to the Army, Murphy received an honorable discharge in October 1945, officially ending his military service. He was just 20 years old. He had survived one of the deadliest wars in human history, earned more medals than any other American soldier, and now faced the daunting question: what do you do with the rest of your life when you've accomplished all of that before you're old enough to legally buy a drink? Murphy initially had no clear plans. He had received his high school equivalency diploma while in the Army, but he had no college education, no professional training, and no real skills beyond farming and combat, neither of which seemed likely to provide a good living in post-war America. He briefly considered staying in the Army as a career soldier, but he found peacetime military service unsatisfying after the intensity of combat. Then something completely unexpected happened. Hollywood discovered Audie Murphy. The story of how Murphy got into the movie business has been told many different ways, but the most reliable account goes like this. In the summer of 1945, while Murphy was still in Europe, the actor James Cagney read about Murphy's exploits in an issue of Life magazine. Cagney, who was one of Hollywood's biggest stars at the time, known for tough guy roles in gangster movies and musicals, was apparently impressed by Murphy's story. Cagney arranged to meet Murphy when the young soldier returned to the United States, and he invited Murphy to come to Hollywood, suggesting that Murphy's natural charisma and authentic war hero status might translate well to film. This was an extraordinary opportunity for someone in Murphy's position. In 1945, Hollywood was one of the most powerful forces in American culture, and movie stars were among the most famous and wealthy people in the country. For a poor kid from Texas with no education and no prospects, an invitation to Hollywood from James Cagney was quite literally a life-changing opportunity. Murphy accepted the invitation and moved to Los Angeles in late 1945 or early 1946. But if Murphy thought the transition from soldier to movie star would be easy, he was quickly disappointed. Hollywood in the 1940 seconds was a brutal, competitive business, and Murphy faced several significant obstacles. First, he had no acting experience whatsoever. He'd never been in a school play, never taken an acting class, never even thought about performing before. Second, Despite his Medal of Honor and his genuine combat heroism, Murphy looked and sounded like what he was: a poor Texas farm boy with limited education and rough manners. He didn't fit the typical Hollywood leading man mold. Third, and perhaps most challenging, Murphy was dealing with severe psychological trauma from his combat experiences, though in 1945, nobody really understood or acknowledged what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. James Cagney was true to his word and helped Murphy get started in Hollywood, though even Cagney's influence couldn't instantly turn Murphy into a movie star. Murphy spent months taking acting lessons, working with dialogue coaches to smooth out his thick Texas accent, studying films to learn the craft of screen acting. He was living in a small, cheap apartment in Los Angeles, subsisting on the modest income from his military pension, about $100 per month, which was barely enough to survive. He was often hungry, often lonely, and frequently wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake in coming to Hollywood. Murphy's first role came in 1948, 3 years after he arrived in Hollywood, when he appeared in a small part in the film Beyond Glory, a movie about West Point starring Alan Ladd. Murphy played himself a Medal of Honor recipient in what amounted to a brief cameo. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He followed this with another small role in Texas, Brooklyn, and Heaven, 1948, a forgettable comedy where Murphy was barely noticeable. These early roles were frustrating for Murphy because they didn't utilize his real talents or experiences. He was being cast as a generic pretty face, asked to play sanitized, two-dimensional characters that had nothing to do with the reality of combat or the complexity of his actual experiences. But Murphy persevered, taking any role he could get, slowly building a filmography, and learning the technical skills of film acting. His breakthrough came in 1949 when he was cast in the lead role of Bad Boy, a film about a juvenile delinquent sent to reform school. While not a major commercial success, Bad Boy demonstrated that Murphy could carry a film as the lead actor, and it led to more substantial roles. Over the next several years, Murphy appeared in a string of Western films and war movies, genres that suited his natural screen presence and tough guy credibility. He made films like Sierra, 1950, Kansas Raiders, 1950, where he played Jesse James, The Red Badge of Courage, 1951, an adaptation of Stephen Crane's Civil War novel, and numerous other westerns and action films. Murphy was not a great actor in the traditional sense. He never had the range or the technique of classically trained actors, but he had something perhaps more valuable: authenticity. When Murphy played a soldier or a gunfighter or a tough young man struggling with violence, audiences believed him completely because they knew his real-life story. There was no artifice, no pretense. Murphy brought to his roles a quiet intensity and a sense of barely controlled violence that was genuinely unsettling at times, because it wasn't acting, it was real trauma and real experience leaking through the screen. By the early 1950 seconds, Murphy had become a moderately successful actor, appearing in several films per year and earning enough money to live comfortably. He married actress Wanda Hendricks in 1949, though the marriage was troubled from the start and ended in divorce in 1951. In 1951, he married Pamela Archer, with whom he would have 2 sons, Terry and James, and this second marriage would last for the rest of Murphy's life, though it too faced serious challenges due to Murphy's psychological issues. But Murphy's biggest Hollywood moment was yet to come, and it would involve telling his own story in his own words. In 1949, while Audie Murphy was beginning his Hollywood career and struggling to find his place in the film industry, he made a decision that would become one of the most important of his post-war life. He decided to write a book about his combat experiences. This was an unusual move for several reasons. Murphy was not a writer, remember? He had only a 5th grade education and had never written anything longer than a letter before. He was also deeply uncomfortable talking about his war experiences, repeatedly insisting in interviews that he was no hero and didn't want to be celebrated. But Murphy felt that the story of his unit, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, deserved to be told, and he wanted to do it before the memories faded and the men who had served with him were forgotten. Working with his friend David Speck McClure, who helped with editing and structuring, Murphy began writing his wartime memoir. The process was painful and difficult. Murphy had to relive every combat action, every death of a friend, every moment of terror and violence. He suffered nightmares while working on the book, often waking up screaming from dreams about the war. His first wife, Wanda Hendricks, later said that Murphy's work on the book made his psychological problems significantly worse, that he became more withdrawn, more prone to violent mood swings, more dependent on sleeping pills to deal with his nightmares. But Murphy pushed through, determined to complete the project. The book was titled To Hell and Back, a perfect summary of Murphy's journey from poverty through combat and back to civilian life. It was published in 1949 by Henry Houghton Company, and it became an immediate bestseller. American readers were fascinated by Murphy's straightforward, unvarnished account of combat, which didn't glorify war but instead presented it as brutal, terrifying, and often senseless. Murphy wrote about fear, about the friends he lost, about the psychological toll of killing, and about the complex emotions that combat soldiers experience. The book was praised by critics for its honesty and its lack of false heroics. Murphy didn't present himself as Superman or superhero. He presented himself as a scared kid who did what he had to do to survive and to protect his men. This authenticity resonated with millions of American readers, including many veterans who had served in the war and recognized the truth in Murphy's account. To Hell and Back remained on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year and sold millions of copies. It was reprinted numerous times and translated into multiple languages. It made Murphy a substantial amount of money, finally giving him real financial security after years of poverty, and it cemented his status as not just a war hero, but also as an author and public figure. But Murphy couldn't escape his own story. In the early 1950 seconds, Universal International Pictures approached Murphy with a proposal. They wanted to make To Hell and Back into a major motion picture, and they wanted Audie Murphy himself to play the lead role. Think about how audacious this was. Murphy would play himself in a film depicting his own combat experiences, including the action that earned him the Medal of Honor. He would have to recreate, in front of cameras, the most traumatic experiences of his life. Most people in Murphy's position would have refused, would have hired another actor to play the role, would have wanted distance between themselves and those memories. But Murphy, in a decision that reveals both his courage and perhaps his psychological need to somehow process his trauma, agreed to do it. Production on To Hell and Back began in 1954, with Murphy signed on as both the star and a technical consultant to ensure the film's authenticity. The film was directed by Jesse Hibbs and featured a large cast of character actors in supporting roles, though Murphy was unquestionably the star. Filming was difficult for Murphy. On the set, he had to stage combat scenes that closely resembled his actual experiences, with explosions, gunfire, and death all around him. Multiple people who worked on the film later reported that Murphy had severe emotional reactions during certain scenes, sometimes freezing up, sometimes becoming angry or withdrawn. The scene depicting the Holtzweiler action, where Murphy stands on the burning tank destroyer and fights off the German attack, was particularly hard for him. Murphy reportedly had to do multiple takes because he kept having flashbacks and emotional breakdowns while filming it. Despite the personal cost to Murphy, the film that resulted was remarkable. To Hell and Back premiered in 1955 and became Universal Pictures' highest grossing film up to that point, earning over $10 million at the box office, which in 1955 was an enormous amount of money. The film was a critical and commercial success, praised for its realistic depiction of combat and for Murphy's understated, authentic performance. Murphy playing himself was not the virtuoso acting performance of a trained thespian, but it had a documentary-like quality that made the film feel more real than typical Hollywood war movies. Audiences responded powerfully to seeing the actual hero of the story depicting his own experiences on screen. The film made Murphy one of the biggest movie stars in America, at least for a few years. He went from being a moderately successful actor in B-westerns to being a genuine Hollywood leading man. He received substantial salary increases for subsequent films, was offered better roles in bigger productions, and became a recognizable face to millions of Americans who might never have known about his wartime service otherwise. But To Hell and Back, both the book and the film had a darker consequence that Murphy probably didn't fully anticipate. They permanently linked his identity to his wartime service. For the rest of his life, Murphy will be known primarily as America's Most Decorated Soldier or the Medal of Honor recipient, rather than as an actor or author or businessman or any of the other things he tried to become. His combat service, which had lasted less than 2 years out of his entire life, defined him completely in the public imagination. This was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him fame and opportunity, but it also trapped him in a role he couldn't escape. constantly reminded him of traumas he was trying to process, and created unrealistic expectations about who he was as a person. Following the success of To Hell and Back, Murphy continued his film career throughout the late 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds, appearing in numerous westerns, war films, and action pictures. Some of his notable films from this period include Night Passage, 1957, The Quiet American, 1958, Cast a Long Shadow, 1959, The Unforgiven, 1960, Seven Ways from Sundown, 1960, and many others. He worked with major stars like John Wayne, James Stewart, and Gregory Peck. He became particularly associated with Western films, appearing in over 30 Westerns during his career, and for a time in the late 1950 seconds, Murphy was one of the most bankable stars in that genre. Murphy also ventured into other areas of the entertainment industry. He had always loved country music, and in the 1960 seconds, he began writing and composing songs, eventually having several songs recorded by well-known country artists. He co-wrote Shutters and Boards and When the Wind Blows in Chicago, among other compositions. He also became involved in horse racing, breeding quarter horses on a ranch he purchased in California. But beneath the surface success, Murphy was struggling. His psychological problems, which we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, grew worse as he aged. He suffered from debilitating nightmares, insomnia, anxiety, depression, and what he called nervous breakdowns. He became dependent on sleeping pills to get any rest at all, sometimes taking dangerous combinations of medications. He had violent mood swings and could be unpredictably angry or withdrawn. His marriage to Pamela, while lasting, was strained by his psychological issues and his frequent absences for film work. What Audie Murphy experienced after World War II, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the anxiety, the depression, the emotional numbness alternating with explosive anger, the dependency on drugs to sleep, the inability to readjust to normal life we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But in the 1940 seconds, 1950 seconds, and 1960 seconds, PTSD didn't exist as an official diagnosis. The military and the medical establishment recognized something they called battle fatigue, or shell shock, or combat exhaustion. But these were seen as temporary conditions that would resolve once a soldier got some rest and got away from combat. The idea that combat trauma could cause permanent, debilitating psychological injury that required treatment was not widely accepted, and there was significant stigma attached to any soldier who admitted to psychological problems. The prevailing attitude was that real men dealt with their problems in silence and moved on with their lives, and any soldier who couldn't do that was weak or cowardly. Murphy, like millions of other World War II veterans, suffered in silence for years. He didn't talk publicly about his psychological problems. He self-medicated with sleeping pills and alcohol, trying to manage his symptoms on his own. He threw himself into work, making film after film, perhaps hoping that staying busy would keep the memories at bay. He isolated himself emotionally, even from his own family, unable to connect with people who hadn't experienced combat and couldn't understand what he'd been through. But by the mid-1960 seconds, Murphy had reached a crisis point. His sleeping pill dependency had become severe. He was taking multiple prescription medications, often in dangerous combinations, just to get through the night. He was having nightmares so severe that he couldn't share a bedroom with his wife because he was afraid he might hurt her during a nightmare. He was experiencing flashbacks where he would suddenly believe he was back in combat, sometimes grabbing weapons or taking cover from threats that existed only in his mind. His film career was declining as Hollywood moved away from the kinds of westerns and war films that had been Murphy's specialty, and he was facing financial problems despite having earned substantial money over the years. In 1969, Murphy made a decision that took tremendous courage. He decided to go public with his psychological problems and to speak openly about the need for better treatment for veterans with what we now call PTSD. This was a radical move. Remember, this was 1969, long before PTSD was an official diagnosis, long before there was widespread public understanding of combat trauma, and Murphy was putting his reputation and his masculine image at risk by admitting that he suffered from psychological problems. But Murphy felt that he had a responsibility to use his fame and his status to help other veterans who were suffering in silence, just as he had been. Murphy gave interviews to newspapers and magazines, speaking candidly about his nightmares, his sleeping pill addiction, and his struggles to readjust to civilian life after the war. He testified before Congress about the need for better veteran mental health services. He worked with veteran advocacy groups. He wrote articles and gave speeches about combat trauma. Murphy specifically focused on the problem of prescription drug addiction among veterans because he had experienced it firsthand. In one particularly brave move, Murphy voluntarily admitted himself to a hospital and went through medically supervised withdrawal from sleeping pills, enduring a week of intense physical and psychological agony as the drugs left his system. He then spoke publicly about that experience, describing the pain and difficulty of drug withdrawal in order to encourage other veterans to seek help for their own addictions. Murphy's advocacy work in the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds helped raise public awareness about combat trauma and contributed to the eventual official recognition of PTSD as a legitimate medical condition. In 1980, 9 years after Murphy's death, the American Psychiatric Association officially added PTSD to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, finally giving a name and a clinical framework to the condition that Murphy and millions of other veterans had suffered from. While Murphy didn't live to see this official recognition, his willingness to speak openly about his own struggles played a role in changing public attitudes and reducing the stigma around combat trauma. In addition to his mental health advocacy, Murphy remained involved in veteran affairs in other ways. He was a life member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and frequently participated in veteran events and commemorations. He advocated for improved veteran benefits and services. He visited VA hospitals and spoke with injured and disabled veterans. He used his celebrity status to draw attention to veteran issues that might otherwise have been ignored. But Murphy's personal life continued to be troubled. His financial situation deteriorated in the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds due to a combination of poor business investments, gambling losses, and declining income from his film career. He made a series of bad investments in real estate and other ventures that lost money. He was involved in lawsuits over business deals gone wrong. By 1971, Murphy was no longer the wealthy movie star he had been in the 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds. He was struggling financially, taking any acting work he could get, and worried about how he would support his family. In May 1971, Murphy was scheduled to appear at the Mid-South Charity Horse Show in Martinsville, Virginia, an event where his presence would help raise money for charity. To get to Martinsville, Murphy boarded a small private airplane on the 28th of May 1971. The flight was routine and the weather was described as poor but not dangerous. The plane, a twin-engine Aero Commander 680, was being piloted by a licensed commercial pilot named Herman Butler, and also aboard were 4 other passengers besides Murphy. At approximately 6 p.m. on the 28th of May 1971, as the plane was approaching Martinsville, it encountered heavy clouds and poor visibility. According to the official investigation conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, the pilot apparently became disoriented in the clouds and descended too quickly while trying to find the airport. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia, about 20 miles west of Roanoke. The impact killed everyone on board instantly. Audie Murphy, the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II, who had survived hundreds of combat actions and had faced death countless times on the battlefields of Europe, died in an airplane crash on a mountainside in Virginia. He was 45 years old. The news of Audie Murphy's death in the plane crash shocked the nation. Despite the fact that Murphy's film career had declined in recent years and he was no longer the major star he had been in the 1950 seconds, he was still a beloved figure to millions of Americans, particularly veterans and the generation that had lived through World War II. The announcement of his death led news broadcasts and appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the country. President Richard Nixon issued a statement praising Murphy's service and his courage. Veteran organizations eulogized him. Thousands of people who had never met Murphy personally felt a genuine sense of loss at his passing. Murphy's body, along with the bodies of the other victims of the crash, was recovered from the mountainside in the days following the accident. The crash site was difficult to reach, located in rugged terrain, and recovery efforts took time. Murphy's remains were positively identified through fingerprints and dental records. His family, including his wife Pamela and his 2 sons, Terry and James, who were still teenagers at the time, were devastated by the loss. The funeral arrangements were handled by the United States Army, which offered Murphy full military honors befitting his status as one of the nation's greatest war heroes. Murphy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Arlington is the nation's most prestigious military cemetery, the final resting place for hundreds of thousands of American service members, including presidents, generals, Medal of Honor recipients, and ordinary soldiers. Being buried at Arlington is considered one of the highest honors the nation can bestow on a military veteran. Murphy's funeral took place on the 7th of June, 1971, and it was one of the largest military funerals Arlington has seen in years. Thousands of people attended, including active duty military personnel, veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, government officials, Hollywood celebrities who had worked with Murphy, and ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects to a genuine American hero. The funeral included full military honors. A horse-drawn caisson carried Murphy's flag-draped casket from the cemetery chapel to his gravesite. An honor guard fired a 21-gun salute, a bugler played taps, and the American flag was carefully folded and presented to Murphy's widow. Several generals and high-ranking officers attended, as did representatives from veteran organizations. The graveside service was simple and dignified, focusing on Murphy's service to his country and his courage under fire. Multiple speakers, including fellow veterans and military officers, spoke about Murphy's combat record, his Medal of Honor action, and his advocacy for veterans in his later years. Some speakers mentioned Murphy's Hollywood career, but the emphasis was clearly on his military service. That was what had defined him in life, and that was what was celebrated in death. Murphy was buried in Section 46 of Arlington National Cemetery, in a grave marked with a simple white marble headstone, identical in style to the hundreds of thousands of other headstones that marked the graves throughout Arlington. The headstone bears Murphy's name, rank, military decorations, and dates of birth and death. It lists him as Audie L. Murphy, Texas, Major, 3rd Infantry Division, Medal of Honor, the 20th of June, 1925, May 28, 1971. The gravestone includes images of Murphy's Medal of Honor and his other major decorations. In the years since Murphy's burial, his grave has become one of the most visited sites in Arlington National Cemetery. On any given day, visitors can be seen at Murphy's grave, leaving flowers, flags, coins, and other tributes. Many visitors are veterans themselves, paying respects to a fellow soldier. Others are family members of veterans, bringing their children or grandchildren to teach them about Murphy's story. Some are simply Americans who believe Murphy's story deserves to be remembered and honored. According to Arlington National Cemetery staff, Murphy's grave receives more visitors than almost any other grave in the cemetery except for President John F. Kennedy's memorial and the tomb of the unknown soldier. This continued visitation, decades after Murphy's death, speaks to the enduring power of his story and his place in American memory. Murphy's legacy extends far beyond his grave at Arlington. After his death, numerous military installations, buildings, and facilities were named in his honor. The Audie Murphy American Cotton Museum in Greenville, Texas, near where Murphy grew up, tells the story of his life and preserves artifacts from his military service and Hollywood career. The museum includes his military uniforms, medals, photographs, and personal items, as well as exhibits about cotton farming in Texas and the poverty that shaped Murphy's early life. The Veterans Administration Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, is named the Audie L. Murphy Memorial Veterans Hospital in his honor, a fitting tribute given Murphy's advocacy for veterans' mental health care. There's the Audie Murphy Middle School in San Antonio and Audie Murphy Ranch in California. The Texas Army National Guard operates Camp Audie Murphy, a training facility near San Antonio. Multiple American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars posts across the country are named after Murphy. In France, where Murphy fought and earned his Medal of Honor, he is still remembered and honored. The town of Holtzwihr, site of Murphy's most famous action, maintains a memorial to Murphy and to the American soldiers who fought there. Every year, on the anniversary of the 26th of January 1945 action, French and American veterans and officials gather at Holtzwihr to commemorate the battle and to honor Murphy's memory. Murphy has been depicted in numerous films, books, and documentaries beyond his own autobiography, and the film To Hell and Back. Historians have written extensively about his combat service, analyzing his tactics and leadership. Military academies use Murphy's actions as case studies in small unit leadership and combat decision-making. The Medal of Honor action at Holsfear is taught at West Point and other military schools as an example of extraordinary courage under fire. But perhaps Murphy's most important legacy is the role he played in changing how America thinks about and treats combat trauma. Murphy's willingness to speak publicly about his own psychological struggles at a time when doing so was considered shameful and weak helped pave the way for better understanding and treatment of what we now call PTSD. Today, when veterans receive treatment for combat trauma, when the Department of Veterans Affairs provides mental health services, when PTSD is recognized as a legitimate service-connected disability, Audie Murphy's advocacy from the late 1960s and early 1970s is part of that history. Murphy's story also continues to inspire Americans who face overwhelming odds or difficult circumstances. The narrative of a poor kid from Texas, undersized and uneducated, who was rejected by multiple military branches but who persevered and became the most decorated soldier of World War II, resonates with the American ideal of success through determination and merit. Murphy never claimed to be special or superhuman. He always insisted he was just an ordinary soldier who did what had to be done, and that humility makes his story even more powerful. It suggests that courage and greatness are not the exclusive property of the privileged or the naturally gifted, but can emerge from anyone when circumstances demand it. In 1996, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative postage stamp honoring Audie Murphy as part of their Distinguished Soldiers series. The stamp featured Murphy's portrait and was dedicated in a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery with members of Murphy's family in attendance. This was a fitting recognition, Murphy's face on a postage stamp carrying mail across America, reminding millions of people of his service and sacrifice. Murphy's sons, Terry and James, have worked throughout their lives to preserve and promote their father's legacy. Terry Murphy, as president of the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, has worked to ensure historical accuracy about his father's life, correcting myths and inaccuracies that have crept into various accounts over the years. Both sons have participated in commemorative events, given interviews, and worked with historians and filmmakers to keep their father's story alive. One particularly interesting aspect of Murphy's legacy is how his story intersects with changing American attitudes about war and heroism. Murphy served and became famous during what's often called the Good War era. World War II is generally viewed by Americans as a necessary and just war against fascism, and the veterans of that war are often idealized as the greatest generation. Murphy fit perfectly into that narrative as the ultimate warrior hero. But Murphy's later struggles with PTSD and his public advocacy about combat trauma complicated that simple hero narrative in important ways. Murphy showed that even the greatest warriors, even Medal of Honor recipients, even those who perform extraordinary acts of courage, can be wounded psychologically by war in ways that don't heal easily or completely. He demonstrated that heroism in combat and vulnerability to psychological injury are not contradictory, that in fact, the very things that make someone an effective combat soldier might also make them susceptible to lasting trauma. This more complex understanding of war and its effects has become increasingly important in American culture, particularly after the Vietnam War, the Gulf Wars, Iraq, and Afghanistan, conflicts that have produced hundreds of thousands of veterans dealing with PTSD and other combat-related psychological conditions. Murphy's example from the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, his willingness to admit vulnerability and seek help, has become a model for contemporary veterans dealing with similar issues. The slogan, "It's okay to not be okay," that's commonly used in veteran mental health advocacy today echoes Murphy's message from 50 years ago. There have been periodic discussions over the years about making a new film about Murphy's life, one that would cover not just his wartime heroics but also his post-war struggles and his advocacy work. Several filmmakers have attempted to develop such projects, but as of 2025, none have come to fruition. Perhaps the challenge is that Murphy's full story, the poverty, the combat, the medals, the Hollywood career, the psychological struggles, the advocacy, and the tragic death is almost too much for a single film to contain. His life was so eventful, so dramatic, and so emotionally complex that doing it justice would require either a very long film or perhaps a limited series format. In 2021, on the 50th anniversary of Murphy's death, there were numerous commemorative events across the United States. At Arlington National Cemetery, a special ceremony was held at Murphy's grave. with military officials, veteran advocates, and family members in attendance. Similar events took place in Texas, in Holtzfire, France, and at various military installations named after Murphy. These commemorations demonstrated that even a half-century after his death, Murphy's story continues to resonate with Americans and with the French people whose country he helped liberate. Looking at Audie Murphy's life from the perspective of more than 50 years after his death, what stands out is not just the extraordinary courage he showed in combat, though that was certainly remarkable, but the full complexity of the man. Murphy was a hero, yes, but he was also a deeply troubled person who struggled with demons that his heroism couldn't defeat. He was a movie star, but he was also a poor kid from Texas who never entirely escaped his hard-scrabble origins. He was the most decorated soldier of World War II, but he was also an advocate for the victims of war, including himself. He was tough enough to stand on a burning tank destroyer and fight off hundreds of enemy soldiers, but he was also vulnerable enough to admit that the experience had broken something inside him that never fully healed. Perhaps that combination of extraordinary courage and human vulnerability is what makes Murphy's story so enduring. He wasn't a comic book superhero without fears or flaws. He was a real person who did heroic things despite being afraid, despite being small and poor and uneducated, despite all the odds against him. And after his heroic service ended, he was a real person who suffered from the consequences of what he'd experienced and who used his final years to try to help others who suffered similarly. That's a more complicated and more meaningful kind of heroism than simple fearlessness or invulnerability would be. Audie Murphy died in 1971, but his story lives on, taught in military academies, studied by historians, commemorated at memorials, and remembered by Americans who believe that some lives and some deeds deserve to be remembered, honored, and learned from. The most decorated soldier of World War II was also, in many ways, the most human, and that humanity, that vulnerability, that complexity is what makes his legacy truly powerful and truly enduring. So what can we learn from Audie Murphy's extraordinary life? What does his story tell us about courage, about war, about heroism, about the human capacity for both greatness and suffering? First, Murphy's story reminds us that heroism often comes from unexpected places. The military recruiters who rejected Murphy in 1941 and 1942, the Marines, the Navy, the Army Air Forces, looked at this undersized, underweight, undereducated teenager and saw nothing of value, nothing that could contribute to the war effort. They were spectacularly wrong. Murphy didn't look like anyone's idea of a warrior or a hero, but he became the greatest combat soldier of his generation. This should make us think about how we assess potential, how we judge people, and how often our assumptions about what makes someone capable or valuable are simply wrong. Murphy's combat record teaches us something about the nature of courage under fire. He wasn't fearless. He wrote extensively in his autobiography about being afraid, about wanting to run away, about the terror of combat. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting effectively despite fear. Murphy learned to function at an extraordinarily high level even when he was terrified, to make tactical decisions and lead men when every instinct was screaming at him to hide or flee. That kind of courage, the courage to act despite fear, not because you don't feel it, but because you've learned to function through it, is perhaps the most valuable kind of bravery, both in military context and in civilian life. The Holtzfire action specifically demonstrates something about leadership and self-sacrifice. Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer, not because he wanted to be a hero, not because he was seeking glory or medals, but because he calculated that it was the only way to save his men and hold his position. He was willing to die, almost certainly expected to die, but he did it anyway because it was his duty as their leader. That kind of leadership that puts the welfare of subordinates above personal safety, is rare and precious, and is why Murphy's men trusted him completely and would have followed him anywhere. Murphy's post-war struggles with PTSD and his eventual advocacy for better treatment of combat trauma teach us that even the strongest people can be broken by traumatic experiences, and that seeking help is not weakness but wisdom. Murphy spent years suffering in silence, self-medicating with sleeping pills and alcohol, because he believed that admitting psychological problems would make him look weak or cowardly. When he finally did go public with his struggles, he discovered that millions of other veterans were suffering similarly, and his willingness to speak openly helped begin the process of destigmatizing combat trauma. In our current era, when suicide rates among veterans are alarmingly high, and when combat trauma remains a serious public health problem, Murphy's example from the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds remains relevant and important. Murphy's Hollywood career, particularly his decision to play himself in To Hell and Back, raises interesting questions about memory, trauma, and storytelling. For most people, recreating the most traumatic experiences of their lives would be unthinkable. But Murphy chose to do exactly that, standing in front of cameras and restaging the battles that had nearly killed him. Was this therapeutic for him, a way of processing his trauma by turning it into art? Or was it re-traumatizing, forcing him to relive experiences that he should have been trying to forget? We don't really know, and Murphy himself gave contradictory answers to these questions over the years. What we do know is that To Hell and Back, both the book and the film, gave millions of Americans insight into what combat was really like, stripped of Hollywood glamour and propaganda. Murphy's financial difficulties in his later years, despite having been a movie star and having earned substantial money, remind us that fame and fortune can be fleeting and that even heroes face ordinary problems like debt and financial stress. Murphy made bad investments, got involved in unsuccessful business ventures, and apparently had trouble managing his money. By the time of his death in 1971, he was no longer wealthy and was in fact struggling financially. This detail, which might seem sordid or unimportant, actually humanizes Murphy in important ways. He wasn't a perfect being. He made mistakes. He had weaknesses and blind spots. The fact that he died in a plane crash, after having survived so much combat, seems almost cosmically unfair. Murphy faced death hundreds of times in combat, dodged bullets and artillery shells and bombs for 2 years, earned the Medal of Honor by standing on a burning vehicle that could have exploded at any second, and then died in a routine flight on a commercial aircraft in peacetime. There's no meaning or justice in that, no poetry or symbolism. It's just a random tragedy, the kind of meaningless bad luck that can end anyone's life at any moment. Perhaps that's part of the lesson, that courage and heroism don't make you invulnerable or immortal, that fate is indifferent to your past achievements, that life can end suddenly and senselessly no matter who you are or what you've done. Murphy's story also reminds us that the veterans of our wars are real people, not abstract symbols or political talking points. They're individuals with complex histories, with strengths and weaknesses, with achievements and failures. They deserve our respect and our support, not because they're perfect or because they're heroes in the Hollywood sense, but because they've been asked to do difficult and dangerous things on behalf of their country, and because those experiences often leave lasting scars, both physical and psychological. Murphy himself would probably be uncomfortable with being held up as some kind of ideal or role model. He repeatedly insisted during his life that he was just an ordinary soldier, that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home, that he didn't deserve special recognition. But the truth is that Murphy's combination of combat effectiveness, leadership ability, moral courage, and personal integrity, along with his post-war advocacy for veterans, does make him worthy of honor and remembrance. Not as a perfect being or a Superman, but as a flawed human who rose to extraordinary challenges and who used his remaining years to try to help others. In the end, Audie Murphy's life was a typically American story in many ways, a story of rising from poverty through determination and ability, of proving doubters wrong, of achieving success against long odds. But it was also an unusually dramatic and tragic version of that story, with higher highs and lower lows than most people experience. From sharecropper's shack to the Medal of Honor to Hollywood stardom to Arlington National Cemetery, Murphy's journey was extraordinary, and the fact that it all happened in a life of just 45 years makes it even more remarkable. If you found this story compelling, if Murphy's life and service moved you or taught you something, I encourage you to visit his grave if you're ever near Arlington National Cemetery, to read his autobiography To Hell and Back if you haven't already, to watch the 1955 film, and most importantly, to remember that behind every medal and every military statistic is a human being with a story. Audie Murphy's story is one of the most remarkable of the 20th century, but it's just one story among millions of veterans who served, suffered, and survived. We owe them all our remembrance, our respect, and our commitment to taking care of them when they return home from war. Thank you for watching, and please like, subscribe, and share this video if you think Audie Murphy's story deserves to be remembered and told to new generations.